Hi there, welcome to this next video. This is lesson 5, and this one's all about techniques for analyzing art. So the way I like to describe this lesson is that you have basically a buffet of options in terms of how you're going to analyze a work of art or a work of architecture. And there's kind of a buffet that you can choose from, and I'm going to go through some of those options. And different artworks can involve different means of interpretation, different methods of analysis. And so we can think about choosing from that buffet of options in order to analyze our images to create meaning in terms of what these works mean. So on the screen, I have just a return of that image of the Studiolo, which was commissioned by a ruler in late Renaissance Italy, and then I'm also showing the US Capitol. And so these are works that are very layered. They have a lot of references to different cultures. In the Studiolo, there's lots of paintings. This was something that was collected by an individual, so you could think about biography. You could think about the histories and the meanings of the paintings here. In terms of the US Capitol, there's a deep historical connection. There's lots of historical events that have happened, but also the way that it's designed in the neoclassical style is very important. So we'll just be thinking about those different layers and how we can employ them as we're analyzing artworks. Okay, so the first method of analysis, and usually this is the way or the place that art historians start, is formal or visual analysis. And so this is something we did back in lesson 2 when we were building up our language of art and architecture, when we were thinking about how can we learn some of these terms in order to describe images, and this helps us with our interpretation. We always say one of the best things to do when you're first looking at an artwork is just describe it and look at it for a very long time. Because the longer you look at a work of art, the more you're going to notice, the more you're going to be able to interpret. But just going through some of those observations, color, composition, texture, what materials are being used, means of representing perspective and space, who are the key features, and what techniques have the artists employed. So things like hierarchy of scale, things like proportion. So we talked a little bit about that with the Transfiguration, or we thought about how that could be applied. And then thinking about the language of architecture. How can we describe the architecture like the architecture of a Gothic structure, like the Gothic cathedral we're seeing, in order to further understand the structure? So one of the best places to start when you're looking at that buffet of options for analyzing works of art is to think about formal analysis, or sometimes called visual analysis. And so formal, we're just thinking about the form of the artwork. So that's the idea there. So that's option number 1. It's always a great place to start. The next option to think about is something called iconography. And so iconography is this idea of literally writing with images, or image writing. So if you think about calligraphy, that's fine writing. So like very beautiful, precise writing. So iconography, icon is image, and graphy writing. So writing with images. And this is really the study of subject matter. And so just this idea of looking at a work of art and trying to determine what was the artist representing. And a lot of the times we can determine what the story was. What is the iconography that the artist is trying to represent? However, there are certain cases when we don't know what the artist was trying to represent. We have to make some hypotheses, or we have to look back at older literature to try to determine what are some of our options. Because when we're looking at older images, we might know a lot of the stories, but we don't know all the stories because we're not living at the same time as the people who created the images hundreds or even thousands of years ago. So for the image that we see on the screen, the subject matter, or the iconography, is the baptism of Jesus, or the baptism of Christ. And we'll talk about that more in the next image. But we can also think about what symbols are embedded into these images, and symbols are elements that represent another concept. Symbols are culturally determined and must be taught. So when I show the Christian symbol of the dove, students often say, oh, that's a symbol for peace. And so in our culture, we often do think about the symbol of the dove as being a peace symbol. But going back about 500 years looking at this work, the dove was actually a symbol for the Holy Spirit. So in Catholic tradition, in certain churches, there's an idea of the Trinity. So this idea of God in 3 parts. So you have God the Father, the Son is Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. And so the Holy Spirit was the dove. So you can just see this hovering dove right here. So again, if you're coming to this image and you're not familiar with Christian iconography, if you're not familiar with the symbols of that period, this is something you're going to have to delve into in order to understand what's going on. Let's look at this image just a bit more closely, a little bit higher quality image that we're seeing here. So you have Jesus at center. He's being baptized by John the Baptist at the River Jordan. You can see the rivers kind of come to a stop right here. You have this wonderful reflective quality of the water, and then you have 3 angels off to the side. You can just see the wings here. And then you have a figure. I always love this figure because he's like, baptize me too, and he's ripping off his shirt or tunic. We have a landscape in the background, probably the artist Piero della Francesca's kind of best approximation of what the area around the River Jordan would have looked like. John the Baptist is in his hair shirt. He was known for living in the desert and living a very simple existence. But this moment where John is baptized by, where Jesus is baptized by John, you can see the water pouring onto his head. And it's this moment where the Trinity is visualized. So I was just mentioning this idea of God in 3 parts. And so it's this moment where Jesus is visualized as divine or as very significant, the Holy Spirit, and God the Father. And sometimes God the Father is shown just with hands. Sometimes you see him more physically. But in this case, there's a large tree. So some art historians have said maybe the tree stands in for the role of God the Father. And so again, there's some question here. We don't know exactly like where is God the Father supposed to be? And so some art historians have suggested perhaps it's the tree. We can do a close-up. This one is tempera, so tempera on panel. Remember we were talking about materials in a previous lesson. So you can see how the tempera creates these very precise single brush strokes. You can see that on the beard here with John the Baptist. And you can see how it's cracked over time, but still in relatively good condition. Oh, excuse me. All right, this is where I like to do a little quiz of what is the iconography? What do you see here? So we'll go through some of the iconography if it doesn't seem as familiar to you. This is the Buddha. And so the Buddha, this is a religion that originated around the area of India, Nepal, with the historical Buddha, and then spread to East Asia and became increasingly popular. But the Buddha is often imagined in our idea as a very large figure. But early on, he was represented as very slender. He often holds a mudra, so a gesture of his hands. And so you can see there's this mudra. You can see that he's in this more slender form. But the Buddha was often represented with a cranial bump. So you have the ushnisha, you have the hanging earlobes, indicating that he was previously of a higher princely status, and he gave that all up in order to find a different way. And so this is a Buddha. He also has a halo around him, indicating his importance, in very simple monastic robes. So again, that rejection of worldly luxuries. Down here, you might recognize that it looks very much like a Greek vase painting or vase painting. And this is supposed to be Athena emerging from the head of Zeus. So a few lessons ago, we were talking about the importance of Athena, and we were talking about the Parthenon, a very important temple dedicated to Athena. And so here you can see the story goes that Zeus had a bad headache, at least in some versions. You can see he's holding on to his lightning bolt here. He's in his throne as leader of the Olympian gods. And Hephaestus, the blacksmith god, comes and whacks him on the head, and out emerges Athena. So there she is, coming fully formed with her shield and everything. She's ready to go. And then lastly, we see Washington crossing the Delaware. So this is George Washington, the first president of the United States. And so this is kind of part of the mythology that developed around George Washington, especially in the 19th century. And so obviously George Washington was an important leader in the Revolutionary War, but especially in the 19th century, he began to be featured even more heavily in works of art to glorify his legacy and to create him into this very important founding father for the United States. So we start to see a lot of paintings featuring him, sculpture, where he's really being shown almost like a god. And so it's interesting, this form that he takes. And this is the story of the challenges of the Revolutionary War and crossing the Delaware around Christmas time during again, the Revolutionary War. Okay, moving on. So this is where we could think about symbolism of architecture and the iconography that can be embedded into architecture. So what information can we know just by looking at the formal elements of this building? And so again, this is the US Capitol in Washington, D.C. And what symbolism might be associated with this style of architecture? So as we look at this structure, we can think about how it's a neoclassical style, meaning it's revisiting the styles of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, which became very popular in the 18th and 19th centuries. You could see that it has columns, it has what look like temple fronts, it has large domes, very similar even to the dome of St. Peter's Basilica in some ways, so even referring to church architecture, also St. Paul's. So there's a lot of references to classical architecture and other structures, and especially European structures. So what's going on here? The idea is that we could refer back to ancient Greece, which is often seen as an important starting point for democracy. The democracy that was used in some Greek cultures isn't what we would consider like a true democracy, but it was the starting point of more involvement of more individuals in the ruling of society or in making decisions for society. So the reference to Greek architecture made sense. In addition to that, the reference to Roman architecture also made sense in the sense of power. So the kind of growing power and ambition of the United States. Many cultures often would want to see themselves as a new Rome because Rome was seen as this very, very powerful empire. And so this idea of trying to, yet again, reinvent the Roman Empire, or at least a very powerful country or sovereign power. Here's a picture of me many years ago where I'm visiting the Capitol, very hot day, and just to show you, it's a huge structure. All right, the U.S. Capitol was developed and built over many successive building phases. So there are many architects listed there. When you visit the Capitol, it's very interesting because you can really see when you're starting to go into different parts of the Capitol. It's very clear where certain, or at least in some parts, you can tell, like here I'm in an older part of the Capitol, and then you move into newer parts of the Capitol. So as I mentioned before, the Capitol's design reflects Greek and Roman architecture. It visually connects the U.S. to democracy in Greece and power in the Roman Empire. And hopefully you can see that connection to things like the Parthenon, that temple dedicated to Athens in Greece, dedicated to Athena in Athens, Greece. Remember the temple's in kind of rough shape, and then we can compare it to the Capitol building. Okay, here we can just see, I'm just comparing it to the Palace of Westminster, which is in London. And so remember that the US had split from the British government. And so there's this clear difference in terms of architectural preferences. So while neoclassicism was popular in some areas of Great Britain, the new capital or the new structure that would be a governing center for London or for Great Britain, they would choose a Gothic style, and the Gothic style was very, very popular. So this kind of neo-Gothic style in the 19th century. And so in the US, they want to go in a different direction. They want to create that clear visual break, going for a different style than what the British were doing. All right, an important thing to remember is that the Capitol's been through a lot. So the War of 1812, the Capitol was heavily damaged. You can see how small the Capitol was at that time. Here I'm just showing you how the Capitol was burned in the War of 1812. I don't know, it's moving. My box moving around. This is just an artistic rendering to give you a sense. More artistic rendering. And then obviously the Capitol has been through additional things more recently. So things like January 6th in 2020. So the structure continues to change over time in terms of historical context too, or historical events that have taken place at this structure. So obviously this is still a relatively new event that took place that is still being discussed by historians. And so this becomes a part of the kind of historical fabric of this structure. Zooming in on the Capitol dome, there's often a question about what is represented on the top. So this is supposed to be a representation of the ideal of freedom on top of the Capitol dome. Very, very large sculpture there. And you can see a replica inside the visitor center. It's very tall. You can see that it's a segmented dome. You can see some of the details of the order. They use the Corinthian order here. In other parts of the U.S. government, so if you visit Washington, D.C., or if you have visited Washington, D.C. previously, you can really see a lot of this neoclassical style. It's not just in the U.S. Capitol. You can see in the Supreme Court and in other structures throughout Washington, D.C., this preference for a neoclassical style that refers to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. All right, let's think more about historical context. So obviously historical context is important for the U.S. Capitol, but let's also think about it as we go back to the Raft of the Medusa. This was a work we looked at in lesson 1. So the Raft of the Medusa is a very significant work in terms of historical context because rather than representing a historical event that took place a long time ago or a religious event or a mythological event, the artist Jericho decided to represent something that happened relatively recently. And so that was the shipwreck that happened off the coast of Africa, and that the ship ran aground, that some people were able to save themselves and others were left on this makeshift raft. And for many days they were left to resort to fighting, cannibalism, and other terrible events, and that many people on the raft died. However, they were eventually saved, as we see in this area over here. So knowing the historical context is very important. So if I were going to do research on this painting and think about the context, I would want to see newspaper articles, analysis that was happening at that time. What was Jericho researching? He did a lot of sketches for this work. So kind of what was he working through? What were some different ideas that he might have absorbed from those current events that he then incorporated into the work? And he obviously tried to make it more heroic and grand to fit the style of Romanticism at the time. So in Romanticism, you often see a lot of drama, strong diagonals. The kind of the power of nature is often really heightened. So you can see these dramatic waves. And the figures are all oriented into this pyramidal composition. So I don't know if they looked like this when they were found, but Jericho has made some deliberate compositional changes to make it into this organized fashion. And then he's also even referencing a figure going back to the literature of Dante. So from the late medieval period, a father who had to who was stuck contemplating eating his sons in Dante. Here you have a father who's contemplating eating his dead son. And so you have this father who's kind of at the end of his rope in the sense of like he's very, very concerned, and he doesn't realize that they have that they've finally found someone who could save them. As we zoom in, we could also think about the context of the growing movement, the growing abolitionist movement. So Jericho also decided to represent an individual of African heritage or African ancestry in order to demonstrate the importance of the abolitionist movement in getting rid of slavery and the mistreatment of those of African heritage or African ancestry. Here are some of the sketches that Jericho created. So you can see him working out some of these different ideas. Where was the boat going to be? That was the boat that's kind of leaving those on the raft behind when there's that moment of them trying to get the attention of the boat that's going to save them. Moving on, we can also think about method of encounter and physical surroundings. So what's the difference between looking at a photograph and then actually being in China at the Imperial Palace of the Forbidden City, or being in England seeing Stonehenge. So these are important issues. Whenever I've seen an artwork on a PowerPoint or on a Google slide presentation or whatever, it's very different when I then go and see a work of art in person, or even a work of architecture as we see here. And that's because in these types of images, you don't get the sense of scale that you should. Also, just seeing what's around a work of art or seeing what's around a work of architecture. How is it presented in that way? For me, I also just remember artworks much better and works of architecture when I see them in person. So there's something about being there that really embeds it into the viewer's memory as well. So with Stonehenge, we often see it at an aerial perspective when we see it in photographs, because we want to see what it looks like all the way around. But if you see photographs of people visiting it, they're so small compared to these very, very large stones. And then with the Imperial Palace, we often because this palace is huge. And so we often just see one structure. And it's important to think about how you would have multiple gates, the layers of the palace you would have to go through in order to reach the emperor or important individuals that you were hoping to encounter. There was something called the inner court and outer court. So the inner court was more the private space of the emperor and his family. The outer court were more the public spaces. So all of that is important to consider. All right. I also just wanted to point out the question of how do museums affect our experiences with works of art? So museums are wonderful for preserving art, trying to keep them safe for generations to come, but it really changes the way we see a work of art. So, for example, Botticelli's Birth of Venus may have been associated with marriage rituals. It may have even been processed for a marriage occasion. And obviously, we're not going to see it in that way anymore. We're going to see it in a stagnant position in a museum. The Mona Lisa is like under layers and layers of glass, and this is not how it was originally intended to be seen. Again, more of a private home portrait. And then Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, just thinking about, like, again, probably intended, this one was probably displayed more in a salon setting and then eventually entered into these museum collections. And then the British Museum is thought to be an encyclopedic museum. It has collections from all different places in the world. And so this is great for learning about these different collections. But again, it's kind of blending things from different areas. The Getty Museum the Getty Center collects from medieval art onwards to about 1900. So that's what you would see there. So museums can specialize in specific areas, or they can be more of these encyclopedic approaches. All right, moving on, we can think about writings about art. This can help us to understand the full meaning. So we can think about art critics, art historians and academics, curators and artists. And these types of writings became more available probably around the year 1500. We seem to have more, 1400, 1500. We seem to have more writings. And then especially as we enter into the 19th and 20th century, we have a lot more art critics and a lot more written material that we can refer to in order to interpret artworks. On the screen, I have a painting by Georgia O'Keeffe, which we'll go into in more detail here. So Georgia O'Keeffe often painted these large, kind of up-close paintings of flowers. She also painted other natural materials and other natural phenomena. She spent a lot of time in New York, but then moved out to the Southwest, to New Mexico. And so her paintings tend to reflect the natural world and some of the things you would also see in the Southwest. So this is Georgia O'Keeffe's Yellow Calla, 1926. And so her writings reveal that she is very interested in nature and she pays close attention to it. So in one of her writings, she says, "There has been no rain since I came out, but today a little came, enough to wet the sage and moisten the top of the dry soil and make the world smell very fresh and fine. I wish I could send you a Mariposa lily." So just this idea that she's very attentive to the natural world. And here I'm just showing you a variety of paintings by Georgia O'Keeffe from different time periods. So 2 from the 20s and 2 from the 30s. But we also have interpretations, and there were many art historians and critics who noted that her work seemed to look like female genitalia, that there might be some kind of physical aspect that related to the female body. And Georgia O'Keeffe's husband was a very well-known gallerist. He was a well-known photographer, Alfred Stieglitz. And so he didn't seem to kind of quash these rumors. It probably helped Georgia O'Keeffe become a more famous artist and to sell more art. In any case, there's a feminist artist, Judy Chicago, who suggests that this is true, that in her paintings, the flower suggests her own femininity through which the mysteries of life could be revealed. So she's really connecting to this idea that it looks very similar or could be connected to the idea of female genitalia. And in fact, Judy Chicago does a large installation that we'll study in a few weeks called The Dinner Party. And for Georgia O'Keeffe's work, she does this up-close version of a flower that looks very, very much like female genitalia. This is a representation of the place setting for Virginia Woolf. So in this dinner party, there's different place settings for important individuals who are female. And so you have artists and writers and mythological figures and all different women brought together. But what's interesting is then later there are art historians and feminist art historians. So Linda Nochlin was a very famous art historian, and Anne Sutherland Harris. So they point out that Georgia O'Keeffe's work has often been labeled as feminine. Her work since 1915 has been labeled feminine by many critics because of its association with a female body, but the wide range of her artistic language would seem to gainsay this simple description. O'Keeffe has rarely made a cause out of being a woman artist. So Georgia O'Keeffe really hasn't been seen as like having a feminist message to her work. And so this seems to perhaps discount the interpretation that this is related to the female body. But this just shows you that many interpretations can be possible based on the writings of art. So I always like to ask the question, is it a love of nature? Is it related to sexual identity? And it points out that the meaning of an artwork is not fixed or permanent, that writers can add new interpretations to the same artworks. Sorry, I keep doing that. We can also think about writings from earlier periods. So in a previous lesson, we were looking at the Sistine Chapel. And so with the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo did not enjoy painting this ceiling, this 12,000 square foot ceiling that took him 4 years. Michelangelo loved sculpture, and he did not want to be painting a ceiling. So there's actually some written documents where he's complaining about it, and one in particular is very famous because it actually shows us how he was painting, right? Where he's kind of looking up at the ceiling and raising his arm. And he complained that his back was really hurting. That reminds me to sit up straight. So he says, I've grown a goiter from this torture, hunched up here like a cat, my brush above me all the time dribbles paint, so my face makes a fine floor for droppings. My skin hangs loose below me, my spine's all knotted from folding over itself. I'm bent taut as a Syrian bow. Because I'm stuck like this, my thoughts are crazy. My painting is dead. Defend it for me, Giovanni. Protect my honor. I'm not in the right place. I'm not a painter. So very, very helpful just to reinforce the fact that Michelangelo was not pleased while he was doing this, that he had to kind of relearn fresco technique in some ways. And it's so informative just for giving us a sense of how he painted and how, the paint's literally dropping on his face. All right, as we move into more modern art, we can think about different approaches such as formalist criticism, psychoanalytic criticism, and semiotics. And so this is where, we get into some more challenging theories, but kind of take each one at a time, and I think you'll get a good grasp of them and think about ways to apply them. So we can look at this artwork by Morris Louis called Blue Veil. And so Blue Veil was created in 1958 during a time when abstraction was especially popular among the New York school. So in New York, after World War II, New York was really seen as the global art capital. And so some important movements, especially called abstract expressionism, became very popular. And so thinking about Morris Louis, this is the idea that artists started to explore a soak stain technique, an idea of letting the paint soak through, and you're really allowing kind of the beauty of these color plays, the natural movement of the paint through the canvas. And so I've often shown this to students. They're like, oh, to me it looks like feathers, or it looks like, stained glass windows, different types of things that might spring to mind. But this is really supposed to be a purely abstract work. And so when we look at a work like this, we have to emphasize formal analysis, and we have to kind of do it at another level beyond our typical formal analysis. So Blue Veil was interpreted as a pure painting by art critics because it eliminated brushstrokes. It emphasized the flatness of the painting surface. And so by using formalist criticism, it can be very helpful when works are highly abstract, minimalist paintings, especially like of the 1960s. Having this formalist approach can be very, very helpful. And throughout the 20th century, we see lots of artists exploring plays of color, using color theory, using highly abstracted, very geometric compositions in some cases, that can help us to understand these works by using this formalist criticism. All right, we can move on to psychoanalytic criticism. This is the idea that art is a product of individuals' past and unconscious urges. This method is appropriate for work that deals with emotional content, dream imagery, or fantasy. And this usually requires analysis of an artist's biography. And so this is a very important theory because it connects to the rise of psychoanalysis in the 20th century, despite the fact that many of the theories of Sigmund Freud and other early psychoanalysts have been disproven or have fallen out of favor. Many of these ideas became very much discussed and thought about in the early 20th century, and thus connected to an art style called surrealism. So we can look at surrealism here. So these are works where unexpected elements are incorporated. They seem almost like dream imagery. So like we have a train coming out of a fireplace here. We have a cup covered in fur, a cup, spoon, and saucer covered in fur. So lots of different kind of unexpected dreamlike imagery. And for artists like Salvador Dali, who painted The Persistence of Memory here, he really thought of his artworks as exploring many of the ideas that Freud was proposing. And Freud was moving around. He was spending time in London as well. So he was really spreading his ideas. In any case, so psychoanalysis can be great for use in art in the 20th century, but any art that relates to trauma or challenges can employ, art historians can employ psychoanalysis if they would like to. So for example, Picasso's Blue period relates to a particular challenging time in his life when he lost one of his best friends, when one of his best friends died. We can also think about, even going back before the rise of Sigmund Freud and his theories, we could think about how art historians have taken a psychoanalytic approach to analyzing the works of Artemisia Gentileschi. So Artemisia Gentileschi, as you recall, was a woman artist who went through a very long trial due to a sexual assault that she suffered by the hands of another artist, Agostino Tassi. And so people have approached this work as relating to maybe her anger through that situation, or exploring some of the violence that she herself suffered, or even her anger at men more generally. So here we can see Judith, remember, beheading the enemy of her people, Holofernes, with the help of her maidservant. And so this becomes increasingly interpreted as something that was created in light of her own biography, and also in terms of what she experienced, the trauma that she experienced. This painting by Leonardo da Vinci, The Virgin and Child with St. Anne, so Freud interpreted a lot of Leonardo's works in relation to psychoanalysis. So Leonardo da Vinci grew up with essentially two mothers. He had a biological mother who was of lower social status, and then later more of a stepmother who was of a higher social status, who was married to his father. And so some people have interpreted this work, which is supposed to be Jesus with his mother Mary and his grandmother St. Anne, as Leonardo with his two mothers, kind of the complication of his own background. Because usually it's represented more in this style when you have the Virgin and Child with St. Anne, but Leonardo has created it as this kind of turning and twisting serpentine posture where the one woman seems to be more distant, more far away, and one is more of this kind of hands-on approach. We can move on to feminist criticism. So this idea of, do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? This is a group called the Guerrilla Girls who create art and posters and media to be publicized in lots of places. So the side of a bus, they'll put it up in galleries to embarrass museums and other cultural institutions. So they point out that less than 5% of the artists in the modern art section are women, but 85% of the nudes in the museum are female. The Metropolitan Museum is probably the most important encyclopedic museum in the United States, the most important historical museum of artworks, and it's in New York. So it's concerned with the oppression of groups, especially women in society. Feminist criticism might also point out when women were often tended to be the object of the male gaze. So we often talk about women being objectified in certain representations, like popular culture or in films. But in this case, we can see them often objectified in paintings through what's called the supine nude pose. So this kind of reclining nude pose where women appear to be heavily objectified, sometimes even with their eyes closed. So it's like they don't even know that someone's looking at them. We can also think about feminist critics as researching women artists who have been ignored in the past. So Artemisia Gentileschi has become increasingly popular, someone who wasn't studied as much but now has received more attention. We can also think more broadly just about gender studies. So what were some of the ways that the ideal woman was supposed to look versus the ideal man? All right, as we move into our last few theories, we can think about semiotics. So this is the study of signs and the study of how signs produce meaning. This is related to theories of structuralism. So the idea that society is very much structured with these repeating patterns, that there are relationships that can be repeated. Structuralists often look for patterns in literature and also in mythology. Historically, that's where they've often pointed it out. So art historians who use semiotics might be interested in this more structuralist approach. So why do I have a stoplight here? So this is often something that's used to show the levels of semiotic analysis. So this idea that when you see something, the form is the signifier. So the red light or the yellow light, and the signified is the message. So the red light, it doesn't inherently mean you have to stop, but the signified is stop, right? There's a cultural way that we've learned that the red means stop or the yellow means slow down. Slow down, not speed up. Semiotics and iconography are different because semiotics is concerned with both the signified and the signifier. So thinking about why does that object signify a particular message, and it's concerned with how the meaning is produced. So why is that red light meaning stop? So that's a very basic way to approach it. We could also think about a more complex approach. So for example, if we go back to Hannah Höchst's Cut with the Kitchen Knife, we can think about how this photo montage brings together all of these different signifiers that creates a kind of semiotic collision. So for someone who was living in the early 20th century, especially living in the Weimar Republic after World War I or the Great War, a lot of these images would have really resonated with individuals. They would have seen different political figures, different artists, different cultural figures. You would have had people who liked the Dada style that Hannah Höchst was working in versus didn't like it, but lots of different signifiers. And you can do this with collages today, right? Or different photo montages. We can also think about deconstruction. So not everything is always stable, right? So semiotics and structuralism posit that things are very stable, meaning is stable, but that's not always the case. So deconstruction is a postmodernist philosophy. I know we're getting deep here. And this deals more with nuance and ambiguity. And so a good example of this is the artist Cindy Sherman. Cindy Sherman is a photographer who engages in a lot of self-portraiture, where she will photograph herself in the guise of different characters, essentially. In this case, this is a self-portrait of Marilyn Monroe, but of course, is it really Marilyn Monroe? When our eyes first look at it, we might say, oh yeah, that's Marilyn Monroe. We recognize this kind of damsel in distress pose, this short hairstyle, the makeup style of the 1950s. But as we look closer, we recognize, oh wait, that's not Marilyn Monroe. So deconstruction posits that any system looks coherent, but it's filled with unseen contradictions, with nuances, and that some of these systems aren't necessarily stable. Here I'm just showing you how Cindy Sherman has a lot of these different types of photographs, and you can see how she takes on these different roles. All right. We have a couple more. We're nearly there. So the last few, we have postcolonialism. Postcolonialism is this idea of thinking about the after effects of colonial practices and thinking about what are the kind of remnants of these colonial practices. So we often see postcolonialism used in artworks that interpret or represent the Middle East, or often the Americas, or sometimes even areas of Asia. So we can see here the artist Jerome, who is kind of creating this pastiche of areas of Egypt, of Syria. So he's taken ideas of tile work that he's possibly seen, and he's even implying kind of his own erotic or like sexualized fantasies. So showing a young boy with his bottom to the viewer, and he's wrapped up in this large snake, and these men are watching him. So this isn't really an accurate representation of the Middle East in the 19th century. It's the fantasy of a French artist in the 19th century. So it's important to remember that there's this long history of colonialism. The British Empire was very vast, but also other European powers were going around and colonizing areas of the Americas, of we can see Australia, Asia, and especially Africa. So this idea of the race for Africa and so many of these cultures trying to colonize. Again, we can think about these kind of fantasies that French artists were bringing to different cultures. So this is called Odalisque with slave, another kind of vision of the Middle East. This was an interpretation of the French artist della of the Natchez Native Americans, the first peoples in the U.S. And so there were lots of stories about Native Americans in the area of the United States. These stories came to Europe, and then they get interpreted into these artworks. And they're not really accurate. It's just kind of bits and pieces put together. We can also think about the way Christopher Columbus was represented in art, especially in the 19th century, and how he gets glorified. And of course, later on, much of his legacy has been questioned by art historians. We can also think about hybridity. So we can think about how cultures use different influences from different places. So the example we have here is the Mass of St. Gregory. This was created in the area of modern-day Mexico or New Spain at the time. It's an Aztec featherwork, but it incorporates the new Christian religion that was coming into Mexico with the tradition of Aztec featherwork. So the two are essentially being blended together. So with hybridity, I like to think about having it's kind of almost like a math equation where you have Aztec featherwork, like the headdress of Moctezuma that we looked at, being added to the tradition of a Christian image or Christian iconography that was known at the time. So what is the Mass of St. Gregory? The Mass of St. Gregory relates to a particular Mass where there was an individual who doubted the presence of Jesus or Christ in the bread or the Eucharist. And so this vision of the bleeding Christ comes, or Jesus comes onto the altar. So that's what we're seeing here. And so you can see Jesus who's bleeding. You see these men of the church. And then in the featherwork, you can see the instruments of what's called the Passion. So this is Jesus being crucified. So things like the nails, the money that's paid to Judas who betrays Jesus, the column that Jesus is attached to and he's flagellated. So all of this is brought together, and we could think about that. So there you can just see the similarities, but also the differences, like how the style of Aztec traditions of art, the composition are different from how we see it in European art. So hybridity argues that cultures are inherently hybrid or mixed and the product of continual intermixing. We could even think about the Demoiselle d'Avignon as having this characteristic, so thinking about the tradition of African masks combined with European cubism, creating this image of the Demoiselle d'Avignon. All right, our last example very quickly is just digital art history. I mean, it's important to think about what are some of the digital tools that are open to us now. How could we interpret art through this kind of digital means? So here I'm showing you a work by Piet Mondrian called The Red Mill, and then I'm showing you how an individual who was very interested in kind of processing images by component analysis, by like image similarity, how you can track artwork along this kind of grid over time. So you can gather artworks, okay, all of these are very similar, these are very similar, and then you have this kind of random one over here. You could see that the Red Mill is a bit unusual, but there's another artwork that's kind of similar, so maybe these were painted around the same time. But just important to think about how could we use some of the digital technologies of today in order to better understand or track large quantities of visual data or large quantities of artworks that exist. So going back, there's the Red Mill. And there it is on the graph. So again, you could think about maybe this is a forgery. Maybe this isn't by Piet Mondrian because it really is kind of off the graph here. For your activity, you're going to be going through these different artworks and thinking about how could you apply these different methods to these different artworks. So have fun with the annotation, and we'll move on to lesson 6. That will be next. Thank you.